The letter came on a Tuesday, tucked between a pizza coupon and a water bill, and it was the reason I found out my mother was trying to sell my grandmother's grave. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Renee Callahan, my mother, from Willowbrook Memorial Gardens, and I only opened it because my mother had asked me months earlier to help sort her mail while she recovered from knee surgery, and I hadn't broken the habit even after her cast came off. I remember standing at her kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, reading the words relocation and resale of plot 3 times before they made any sense at all. Dear Ms. Callahan, this letter confirms receipt of your signed authorization to proceed with the disinterment and relocation of the remains currently held at Plot 114 Section C, and the subsequent resale of the plot to Ridgeline Development Partners as part of the Willowbrook Expansion Agreement. Compensation in the amount of $38,000 will be issued upon completion of the relocation process, per our agreement dated the 14th of last month. Please contact our office to schedule the disinterment. I read it a 4th time because some part of me was certain I had misunderstood something. Plot 114 Section C was my grandmother's grave. Grandma Opal had been buried there for 3 years, under a modest granite headstone with her name and a line she'd chosen herself before she died. Loved fiercely, remembered longer. I had picked out that stone with my mother standing right beside me at the funeral home, both of us crying, both of us agreeing it was perfect. And now my mother had signed papers to dig her up and sell the ground she was buried in. I want to tell you how I got to that kitchen counter, because the letter alone doesn't explain anything. It just opens the door. What's behind it took years to build, and most of those years I didn't understand what I was looking at until it was almost too late to stop it. My name is Ivy Callahan. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my childhood, my grandmother raised me more than my mother did. My parents divorced when I was 4, and my father moved to Arizona and mostly disappeared from my life except for birthday cards that arrived a week late and phone calls that got shorter every year until they stopped altogether. My mother worked 2 jobs trying to keep our apartment, and on the days she couldn't, which were most days, I went to Grandma Opal's house 3 streets over. A small blue rambler with a garden gnome missing 1 ear and a kitchen that always smelled like cinnamon. Grandma Opal wasn't a wealthy woman. She'd worked as a school secretary for 31 years and lived carefully, the way people do when they've never had much cushion between themselves and disaster. But she had a way of making a little feel like enough. She taught me to sew buttons back onto my school uniforms instead of throwing them away. She taught me to read an electric bill and understand where every dollar went. She taught me, more than anything, what it felt like to be someone's whole world instead of an inconvenience squeezed between someone else's obligations. I remember specific evenings from that house with a clarity that surprises me even now, more than a decade later. Grandma Opal at the stove, stirring a pot of something simple, humming a hymn under her breath without seeming to notice she was doing it. The 2 of us at her kitchen table doing my math homework, her patiently walking me through long division with a pencil that never seemed to need sharpening, though I suspect now she kept several spares hidden in a drawer just in case. Saturday mornings spent at the community garden 2 blocks from her house, where she grew tomatoes and green beans in a plot she'd tended for over a decade, teaching me which weeds to pull and which volunteer sprouts to leave alone because sometimes, she said, the things that show up uninvited turn out to be worth keeping. She never once, in all those years, made me feel like I was a burden being passed between 2 households that couldn't fully manage me on their own. She made me feel chosen, every single day, in 100 small ways that added up to something enormous by the time I was old enough to understand what a gift that had actually been. My mother, meanwhile, always seemed to be chasing something just out of reach. A better job that never quite materialized. A boyfriend who'd finally treat her right until he didn't. A lottery ticket that would change everything, bought with grocery money more times than I want to remember. By the time I was in middle school, I understood that my mother and money had a complicated, painful relationship. One where money always seemed to slip through her fingers the moment she got close to holding onto it, and where the people around her, myself included, sometimes got caught in that slipping. There was an incident when I was 16, one that Grandma Opal never fully explained to me at the time but that I pieced together years later. My mother had, for a period of about 8 months, been managing Grandma Opal's finances while my grandmother recovered from a hip replacement. When Grandma Opal was well enough to check her own accounts again, nearly $4,000 was missing, moved in small, careful withdrawals that looked, on paper, almost like nothing at all. Grandma Opal never called the police. She never even confronted my mother directly as far as I know. She just quietly took her finances back, hired her own accountant from that point forward, and started keeping certain things closer to her chest. I only found out about the missing money because I overheard Grandma Opal on the phone with her accountant years later saying, "I just need to make sure this can't happen again. Not to me and not to Ivy after I'm gone." I didn't understand what she meant by that sentence until much, much later. Grandma Opal died 3 years ago in her sleep at 78 years old, the kind of peaceful death people say they hope for and rarely get. I was the one who found her because I'd taken to stopping by most mornings on my way to work with coffee and the newspaper she still insisted on having delivered, even though she mostly used it for the crossword. I called 911 and I sat on her kitchen floor until the paramedics arrived, and I have never in my life felt a grief that sharp before or since. The funeral was small. My mother, my younger brother Derek, a handful of Grandma Opal's old co-workers and church friends, and me. My mother cried, and I remember being surprised by that because their relationship had always seemed strained to me, distant in a way that felt deliberate on both sides. I remember thinking watching her at the graveside that maybe I'd misjudged something. Maybe there was more love there than I'd given her credit for. I understand now that some of those tears may have been about something else entirely. Grief has a way of looking the same on the outside no matter what's actually driving it underneath. Grandma Opal's will was simple, or at least it appeared that way. The house went to my mother since my mother was her only child. A modest savings account, around $22,000, was split between my mother and Derek and me equally. And there was a smaller, separate account, about $8,000, left specifically to me with a note attached that read, "For Ivy, so she always has something that's only hers." My mother didn't contest any of it, didn't even comment much on the uneven distribution, which at the time I took as another sign of her grief softening whatever resentment might have existed. The house sold about a year after the funeral. My mother needed the money, she said, for a fresh start, and none of us argued because grief makes people want fresh starts, and who was I to stand in the way of that? I didn't think much about where the money went after that. I had my own life, my own apartment, my own job managing operations for a regional healthcare clinic, and I let my mother's finances become, once again, something I didn't ask too many questions about. That was my first mistake. I know that now. The second mistake was not paying closer attention to the calls my mother started getting, about 8 months before I found that letter on her kitchen counter. She'd mention them occasionally, offhand, in the tone people use when they're testing whether a subject is safe to bring up. "The cemetery keeps calling about some expansion thing," she said once over dinner. "Something about the older sections. I don't really understand it." I asked her what they wanted. She waved a hand. "Just paperwork stuff. Probably nothing." It was not nothing. Willowbrook Memorial Gardens, as it turned out, sat on a piece of land that had become extremely valuable over the past decade, as the suburb around it filled in with new housing developments and a shopping center went up 2 miles down the road. Ridgeline Development Partners had been quietly buying up land adjacent to the cemetery for years, and eventually made an offer that the cemetery's ownership, a private company more interested in profit than sentiment, found difficult to refuse. Part of that deal involved persuading families to relocate the remains of loved ones buried in the older, less profitable sections of the cemetery, freeing up the land for resale, in exchange for a compensation payment and a complimentary relocation, to a newer section further from the road. Section C, where Grandma Opal was buried, was exactly the kind of older section Ridgeline wanted. My mother had been offered $38,000 to authorize the disinterment and sale. I sat with that letter for a long time before I did anything with it. I read it probably a dozen times, checking the name, the plot number, the date of the signed authorization, hoping somehow I'd find a detail that made this all a mistake, a case of mistaken identity, a clerical error at some overworked cemetery office. But everything matched. Plot 114, Section C. My grandmother's grave. My mother's signature, authorized weeks earlier, without a single word to me or Derek about it. I confronted her that same afternoon, the letter still in my hand, my voice shaking in a way I hated. "What is this?" I asked, holding it out to her. She looked at it and something crossed her face, quick and calculating, before it settled into an expression of practiced calm. "It's not what it looks like. It says you signed papers to dig up Grandma and sell her plot to a developer." "Ivy, sit down. Let me explain." "I don't want to sit down. I want to understand why you did this without telling me." She sighed, the kind of sigh that was meant to make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. The compensation is substantial, Ivy. $38,000. Do you know what that kind of money could do for this family? For Derek's tuition, for my retirement, for you, even if you just let me explain how I was planning to split it. She's not a plot of land, Mom. She's Grandma. She's a person you're talking about digging up like she's a fence post in the way of a new road. The dead don't need anything, my mother said, and her voice had a hard edge to it now, something I recognized from arguments throughout my childhood, the tone she used when she decided she was right and intended to hold that ground no matter what. The living do. Your grandmother is gone, Ivy. She doesn't care where her bones are. But I'm still here, and Derek's still here, and you're still here, and we could all use that money a lot more than a headstone needs to sit in that particular 6 feet of dirt. I remember staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of me with the mother who had cried at that graveside 3 years earlier, and feeling something inside me go cold and very, very still. You're not doing this, I said. It's already signed, Ivy. It's not up to you. It's not up to you either. I'm listed as co-executor on Grandma's estate. You never closed that out, remember? You kept me on it because it made the bank paperwork easier when the house sold. That means any decision about her remains needs my signature too. I didn't actually know if that was true legally. I was guessing, throwing something out based on a half-remembered conversation with the estate lawyer from 3 years earlier, hoping it would land. But I watched my mother's face change just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through the practiced calm, and I knew I'd found something worth pulling on. I called the estate lawyer, a woman named Diane Whitfield who had handled Grandma Opal's affairs for over a decade, first thing the next morning. I explained the letter, the compensation offer, my mother's signature, everything I knew. Diane went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. Ivy, she said finally, I need you to come into my office. There's something in your grandmother's file I think you need to see. I sat in Diane Whitfield's office 2 days later, across a wide oak desk cluttered with case files, and she slid a folder toward me that I'd never seen before. It was labeled in Grandma Opal's own careful handwriting on the tab, in case. Your grandmother came to me about 18 months before she passed, Diane said. She wanted to add some protective language to her estate plan. She was worried about something specific, and she asked me to keep this particular document sealed unless a very specific circumstance occurred. What circumstance? Any attempt to disturb, relocate, sell, or otherwise interfere with her burial plot without your written consent. I stared at her. She planned for this? For exactly this. Diane nodded slowly. Your grandmother told me, and I'm quoting her as closely as I can remember, that she didn't trust your mother not to try something like this someday, if the land ever became valuable enough. She said, and again, these are close to her exact words, Renee has never been able to leave money on the table, even when the table belongs to someone she loved. She wanted a safeguard in place. Something that would protect the grave and protect you if it ever came to this. I opened the folder. Inside was a formal legal document, notarized, dated about 1.5 years before Grandma Opal died, establishing a restrictive covenant on the burial plot that required the written consent of both listed co-trustees, myself and Diane Whitfield acting as the estate's legal representative, before any disinterment, relocation, or resale could proceed. My mother's signature alone, whatever she'd been told by the cemetery or the developer, was legally insufficient. The cemetery's own records office should have caught this discrepancy, but in the rush of a large land deal with dozens of families and plots involved, something had clearly slipped through. But there was more in that folder. A second document, this one a letter handwritten, addressed to me. Ivy, if you're reading this, it means something happened that I hoped never would. I want you to know I didn't do this because I don't love your mother. I do. She's my daughter and I raised her the best I knew how with what I had, which wasn't always enough. But I've watched her make choices with money my whole life that scared me, and I've watched the way she looks at things sometimes, like everything has a price tag on it even when it shouldn't. I don't think she's a bad person. I think she's a frightened person who never learned that some things aren't for sale, no matter how badly you need the money. I couldn't protect you from everything, sweetheart. But I could protect this. I could protect the one place where I get to just be your grandmother, resting without anyone deciding I'm worth more moved than I am staying put. I hope you never have to read this letter. But if you are reading it, I need you to be strong the way I taught you to be, And I need you to know that stopping this isn't a betrayal of your mother. It's the last thing I can do to take care of you, even from wherever I've gone. I love you more than any account balance could ever hold. Grandma. I sat in that office and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the morning I found her on the kitchen floor. Diane Whitfield sat quietly and let me, sliding a box of tissues across the desk without saying anything at all, giving me the space my grandmother had apparently known, even from beyond her own death, that I would need. What happens now? I asked once I could speak again. Now, Diane said, we send a formal notice to the cemetery and to Ridgeline Development Partners informing them that the authorization your mother signed is invalid under the terms of the restrictive covenant. The disinterment can't legally proceed without my consent, alongside yours, and I'm not giving it. Neither, I assume, are you. Never, I said. There's something else you should know, Diane added, her expression turning more careful, more measured, the way people look when they're about to deliver news they know will hurt. When your grandmother came to me to set this up, she also asked me to review the trust distributions from her estate more closely, because something had been bothering her. She'd noticed discrepancies in the 8 months your mother managed her finances years earlier, discrepancies she never fully pursued at the time, and she wanted to understand whether anything similar might be happening again, with the smaller trust account she'd set up in your name. My stomach dropped. The $8,000? Diane nodded. I did some digging after your grandmother passed, mostly as a formality, closing out the estate properly. Ivy, that account was never actually $8,000. It was closer to $22,000. Your grandmother had been adding to it quietly for years, birthday money, small deposits here and there, wanting to build something substantial for you without drawing too much attention to it while she was still alive. But by the time the estate was settled and the funds distributed, only $8,000 remained. The rest had been withdrawn in the months leading up to her death, while she was recovering from a fall that kept her largely housebound and dependent on family for help with errands, including banking. I felt the room tilt slightly. Who had access to that account? Your mother, Diane said quietly. She'd been added as a secondary signer years earlier, back when your grandmother first opened it, purely as a convenience in case of emergencies. I don't think your grandmother ever suspected it would be used the way it apparently was. I want to tell you I was shocked, but sitting in that office holding my grandmother's letter, I mostly just felt tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than a bad night's sleep. Tired in the way grief and betrayal together create a specific bone-heavy exhaustion that makes even breathing feel like an effort. I confronted my mother again that same week, this time with Diane Whitfield present, in Diane's office rather than my mother's kitchen, because I didn't trust myself to have this conversation on her home turf, where she'd spent 31 years learning exactly how to manage me. My mother arrived defensive, arms crossed before she'd even sat down. I don't know what this is about, but I already told Ivy, the compensation from Willowbrook is going to help all of us. This isn't about Willowbrook, Diane said calmly, sliding a printed bank statement across the table. This is about withdrawals made from a trust account in Ivy's name, in the 8 months before your mother passed away. My mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession, the way a person's does when they're trying to decide in real time which lie will hold up best under scrutiny. That money was for expenses. Her care. Groceries, her medications, the home health aid, some weeks when I couldn't be there myself. I was managing her finances during a difficult time, and yes, I used some of that account, but it was for her, Ivy, not for me. Then you'll have receipts, Diane said. Documentation. Something that shows $14,000 went toward your mother's care and not somewhere else. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know, even before my mother's shoulders dropped, even before the fight seemed to go out of her all at once, leaving behind something smaller and more exposed than I'd ever seen from her. I was going to pay it back, she said finally, quietly. I had some debts. Credit cards from after your father left, that I never fully dug myself out of. And then the car needed work, and then there was a stretch where I lost hours at the salon, and I told myself I'd pay it back before she ever needed it, before you ever needed it. And then she died, and I panicked because there was no way to pay it back anymore, no way to fix it without everyone finding out what I'd done. So instead you tried to sell her grave, I said. To cover it up or to get even more money on top of what you already took? Both, she admitted, and something about her honesty in that moment, stripped of all the careful justification, was almost worse than the lie had been. I thought if the Willowbrook money came through, I could quietly settle things. Pay you back what I owed without ever having to explain why. I didn't think anyone would ever connect the two things. I didn't think you'd find out about either one. She knew, I said. Grandma knew, or at least suspected, and she protected herself. She protected me. She set up a legal safeguard specifically because she didn't trust you not to do exactly this. My mother flinched, and for the first time in the entire conversation, tears actually came, real ones, not the practiced kind. She never said anything to me. Never once accused me of anything. Would you have stopped if she had? She didn't answer that question right away. She sat with it for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the table like she needed something solid to hold on to, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost all the sharp edges it carried when she first walked into that office. I don't know, she said. I want to say yes. I want to believe I would have looked at my own mother's face and stopped myself before I ever touched that account. But I can't promise you that, Ivy, because I don't actually know who I would have been if she'd confronted me directly instead of just quietly building a wall around what mattered. Maybe I would have found another way around it. Maybe I would have finally stopped. I've spent a long time not liking the answer to that question, whichever one it turns out to be. I didn't know what to do with that kind of honesty, so raw and unflattering, offered without any real attempt to soften it. Part of me wanted to hate her more for admitting it. Another part of me, smaller and more tired, almost respected that she hadn't tried to lie her way out of the question entirely, the way she'd lied about so many smaller things over the years. Would you have stopped if she had? She didn't answer that question, and I think we both understood that the silence was its own kind of answer. The legal fallout took several months to fully resolve. Diane Whitfield formally blocked the disinterment authorization, and Ridgeline Development Partners, faced with a legally binding restrictive covenant and the threat of a public dispute over grave desecration, quietly withdrew their offer and redirected their expansion plans to a different section of the cemetery where no such complications existed. Grandma Opal stayed exactly where she'd been laid to rest, under her headstone that read "Loved fiercely, remembered longer," in the ground she'd chosen for herself, protected in death the way she'd tried, imperfectly but persistently, to protect me in life. My mother repaid the missing trust funds over the following year. A slow, humbling process that involved selling a car she loved and taking on extra shifts at the salon where she worked, alongside a small loan from Derek, who took the news of everything harder than I expected, given how close he and my mother had always been. He didn't defend her, not once, which surprised me, though maybe it shouldn't have. He'd loved Grandma Opal too in his own quieter way, and something about watching our mother try to sell her grave broke something in him that repaying money alone couldn't fully fix. I didn't press criminal charges. Diane Whitfield advised me it was within my rights to, given the documented misuse of trust funds, but I sat with that decision for a long time before deciding against it, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a tired, weary sense that some debts are better settled outside a courtroom, even when the law would technically allow for more. My mother and I aren't close now, not the way we might have been in some other version of our family's story. We speak occasionally, carefully, the way people do when trust has been broken, in a way that reshapes the entire architecture of a relationship rather than simply denting it. I visit Grandma Opal's grave more often now than I did before any of this happened. I bring fresh flowers, usually daisies, because she loved daisies more than any fancier flower anyone ever tried to talk her into. I sit on the small stone bench near her plot and I talk to her sometimes, out loud, the way people do when grief eventually settles into something closer to companionship than pain. Last month I brought Diane Whitfield's final invoice with me, the last piece of paperwork closing out the legal dispute completely, and I sat on that bench and read it out loud to my grandmother's headstone, like a report card, like proof that the thing she tried to protect had actually held. "You knew," I told her, tracing the letters of her name carved into the granite. "You knew exactly what she might try, and you built a wall around this place before you even needed one. I don't know how you carried that kind of worry quietly for so long, but I'm grateful you did." The cemetery groundskeeper, an older man named Walter who'd worked at Willowbrook for over 20 years, stopped by while I was there, the way he sometimes did, to check on the flower arrangements or trim the grass along the plot borders. "Your grandmother's one of the lucky ones," he said, nodding toward the headstone. "Whole section around her almost got dug up last year. Big fight over it from what I heard. Somehow her plot got left alone when half the others around it moved." I smiled, a small, tired smile that held more history in it than Walter could have guessed. She planned ahead, I said. She always did. He chuckled, not fully understanding, and moved on to the next row, and I sat there a while longer in the quiet, in the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has finally, completely passed. My mother once told me the dead don't need anything, that the living do, as if that simple truth gave her permission to take whatever she wanted from the space between those two facts. But sitting there on that bench, months after everything came apart and slowly began to knit itself back into something new, I understood something she never quite grasped. Not really, not in the way that would have changed how she moved through the world. The dead don't need anything, she was right about that much. But the living need more than money. We need to know that someone, somewhere, loved us enough to build a wall around the parts of us too precious to be sold even after they were gone. We need proof that love can outlast a person's own lifetime, tucked into a folder labeled "in case," waiting patiently for the day it might be needed. Grandma Opal gave me that proof. She gave me a grave that stayed put, a trust that eventually held, and a lesson about the difference between people who see family as something to protect and people who see it as something to spend. I know which kind of person I want to be the rest of my life, whatever it costs. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place?